Hi, welcome to another exciting episode of the Andre The Beast Crayton Show. Another exciting show, and definitely, and I do mean definitely, another exciting guest. Let me tell you about today's show. This show is really about education today. It's about how one man's research led him down a whole bunch of rabbit holes. And it's funny because I tell people knowledge is power, but useless knowledge is not digging deeper into what you find. I think a lot of people get afraid because they go, oh, well, I don't really want to go that far. But this man has taken 8 books, which we'll talk about those 8 books and how they impacted him. And more importantly, how he's trying his best to empower, educate, and let's call it what it is. Wake up your class consciousness. Let's welcome to the show the one, the only, Mr. Education himself, Mr. Scott Bennett. What's up, big guy?
Andre, thank you so much for that introduction. That was wonderful. I'm doing great. I'm so happy to be here with you today. Thank you for having me.
You know, I like the beard. I just shaved mine off.
You look great in the picture behind you. I was like, whoa, that's
You know,
beautiful. But, it all comes back.
yeah,
It
yeah,
ebbs and flows.
it'll come back. As you know, I just got tired of people saying, you like Santa Claus. I'm like, really? Santa Claus?
Yeah.
That's the most I can get after growing a beard is Santa Claus? Come on, man.
One of my best friends is Jewish, and he had a big beard like us.
Yeah.
And he said that people would come up to him, and he could feel the respect from the wisdom that the beard conferred. Even in the store, people would be like, "Sir, what do you think?" And it was like he became a rabbi just by the power of his facial hair. And I think, I
Yeah.
think a white beard, yes, Santa Claus, yes, but also it says you are wise.
You know, you know what? I 100% agree with that. But you know, having the beard every now and then, you know, somebody at a barber screws it up, and you have to
Oh
just
yeah.
like take it off, redo
Yep.
it, and then go. I'm not going to you no more. But
You,
with
you
that
know, uh,
said, with that said,
Andre,
that
I have about 30 years of experience now trimming my own beard and using different trimmers and,
yeah,
working on the symmetry, keeping it symmetrical. It's a
yeah,
full-time job.
yeah. And I tell people, you know, that was a full-time job. You
Yeah,
know, this is easy. Now just brush it, and they go, "Why you brush?" I said, "That's how you get it to grow back." But
that's right.
let me tell you what I like about you and following you on social media is your class consciousness. Before we get started on that particular word, tell the viewers a little bit about you.
Um, I'm what you might call an autodidact. That's a fancy word that means self-taught. I went to University of Michigan up in Ann Arbor, which is a great school, but I don't like to rest on any of my academic bona fides because I don't have a lot. I'm not a PhD. I'm not a professor, but all of the things that I've learned about class consciousness have come from books and just educating myself, like you say. And it's not impossible to do. A normal person can move through the world and understand these concepts. And I feel like a lot of people already kind of get the idea before they even hear the words class consciousness. We know that rich people basically run our society. That's not saying that isn't shocking, and it's not a conspiracy theory. It's just the facts of the matter, and it's been that way for a long, long time. But it doesn't have to stay that way. It's possible for the people to be empowered and to make changes that benefit the mass population.
You mentioned class consciousness, and you went to college. I went to college. I enjoy the books that you read, and we'll talk about that later. But you grew up in the Michigan area, and so what was
That's
it
right.
like growing up for you before you even got to being awakened? Let's call it what it is with class consciousness. What was it like growing up for you as a young man in Michigan?
Um, I was always a good student. I never found it super difficult to get A's and B's in school, so I'm lucky in that way. But I always had what you might call an anti-authoritarian streak. I've always had a hard time with people who want to boss you around because they're in charge.
Mhm.
And it can be a small thing. It can be like a security guard at a store,
Mhm.
or a lifeguard at the pool, or it could be a teacher or a vice principal at your school. Like, people who are empowered with some level of authority and think that they can tell you what to do, tell you what to think. And I've always resisted that. I've always
Mhm.
had a hard time with that. And I know that's not uncommon. I know a lot of people feel that way.
Mhm.
But I think in this day and age, and this society especially, uh, there's a real pressure to follow the leader or follow authority, and
Mhm.
I'm just here to reject that entirely.
The way I want to do this show, and I'm gonna let the viewers understand, because we're definitely gonna do a part two, because your story is so impactful and engageable. And for the ones who are in the same boat as you were, will get the message. Those that don't get the message, we're going to make them understand why they should today. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start out with at least one of the books. We're going to go through all 8 books that shaped you. And
Oh,
I'm going to tell the audience why we're going to do this in part 1. Because at first we just going to do 30 minutes. I was like, no, we can't put this in a 30-minute, but we can start with the journey on what led this whole class consciousness. Because I think in order for people to understand anything, you have to start from the beginning. And what led you to the first book that changed your life? And I think the book was called "Who Would Tell the People" by William.
yeah,
Right.
I could pull all those books out because I got them right here on my bookcase. But that one, all right. So I graduated college in 2001. I was going to go live in Turkey. I was going to teach English in Turkey. I took 4 semesters of Turkish language, and
Mm-hmm.
I was all set to go live over there in 2001. I was supposed to fly out September 13th, 2001. And of course, September 11th, 2001 happened, and everybody I knew was like, "Oh my God, you can't go live in the Middle East. You can't go do
Right.
it." So I didn't. I ended up staying here, and starting a career in media. But I I always had a hard time with the Bush administration, George W. Bush, the second Bush, and I felt like he was lying about the weapons of mass destruction. It felt to me from the very start just
Mm-hmm.
like a pretext, like a made up thing to get us into war. And I was not happy. I was listening to talk radio, and I was, uh, reading the New York Times, and feeling dissatisfied by the kind of message that I was getting from all the
Mm-hmm.
mainstream sources. And I
Mm-hmm.
was feeling that frustration for a long time. And I was feeling like the Democrats were just as much a problem as the Republicans in kind of maintaining the existing hierarchy of power.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was feeling very fed up by the end of the Bush administration. And that's when I decided that, I had an idea for a third political party back then. And that set me on a journey for writing a book, which never was actually published. But it's called. I was going to call it "Let's Make Them Pay," and that's what all my social media channels are called. Let's Make Them Pay,
Mm-hmm.
a one word, and that's how I found William Greider's book, because I was looking for things to understand, like why why things never change, why is it so hard for things to change for the people, for the public.
Mm-hmm.
And Greider's book, he took a look at our government, and how money power is really the main thing that guides our legislation and what actually happens in government.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a big eye opener for me. There's one passage in there where he talks about there was some congressman, and they were arguing about some law were going to pass that was mostly going to benefit corporations. And this congressman was like, can't we once in a while just do one thing for the public to
Mm-hmm.
actually help them when we pass these laws? And it just was like a light bulb went off when I heard that. I was like, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
why is that so hard? How come that never happens?
Mm-hmm.
And that leads us to, the wider discussion of class consciousness, because there's this word woke. The President Trump and his administration hate everybody who's woke right now. They
Yeah.
try to turn woke into a bad word. But
Mm-hmm.
what does woke mean? Woke means awake,
Yeah.
and consciousness is when
Right.
you're awake.
Mm-hmm.
And so class consciousness is just adding to that awake, to being awake to the fact that the rich, the we call them the rich, but what they really are is the owning class, the people who own all the companies and all the stocks and all the wealth in our country call all the shots.
Yeah.
And so that's what it means to be class conscious, is to see that. And then once you're aware of that, you can start to see how our class structure operates in this country, and how the working class, all the people like you and me who live off our paychecks, we don't live off of generational wealth. We
Right.
don't live off of stocks that our parents owned, or companies that our parents owned. That's the owning class. We're the working class,
Right.
and we always get hosed
Right.
by our government, by both parties. And so, I just wanted to find out, how do we start working against that? How do we start pushing back? How do we get a government that actually cares about us?
It's funny that you said that, and it was a good book. I skimmed through a lot of them before we had you on the show, and some of them I had already read. And
Nice.
I just really think that it's funny. Let's call it like this. We can look at other countries and see the caste systems that they and we can label them, but we fail to realize we're in the same situation. It's just called differently. And you named it
That's
that
right.
on the thing. I mean, you see how we been you see you should every person should look at their lives and ask them, are you a puppet? Are you part of this system? Because if you go to work every day and you do the paycheck, you're part of what Scott is actually talking about. But what I'm getting ready to ask Scott, and I know this is hypothetical, if the people that are woke sees this and have always seen it, I'm gonna be honest, I've seen it ever since I was a kid. I was just like you. I was
Yeah.
like, something just ain't right. And I was in elementary school. I was like,
Yeah.
something just ain't right. I remember them telling my mom something's wrong with him. Wasn't nothing wrong with me. I just happened to realize
Mm-mm.
that what you're talking about is shit. I'm just too young
Yeah.
for you to pay it any attention. But with
Yeah.
that said, and using that particular book by William, what do you think that people are re- not willing to see what's actually being taken place? And we'll use this as an example. We talk about the hierarchies, the people that make the laws and people that control the money, the billionaires and so forth. There's not a lot of billionaires in this country. So that shows you another thing, that it's only a select few that's making policies. But with that said, let's just use what we talked about. Even something as far as a SNAP benefit program has now been pretty much dissolved. And people have yet to ask themselves, how did this happen? Who pulled the strings? And more importantly, the people that pull the strings don't give a fuck about you anyway, because you're part of that class conscience, and you got to ask yourself which one of them, which category you falling in, and that should explain to you why these things were being taken away. And my theory is, you put it wasn't benefiting the hierarchies.
Mm-hmm.
They was spending money to keep you there. Now they was like, we're done with this. Now
Mm-hmm.
you look at it and say, well, how is this going to affect the economy? They don't give a fuck whether it affects the economy. They want to know what you're going to do. Your survival instinct is going to make you steal, which is going to put you, which was one of the books we're going to talk about, which is going to keep the rich richer, is going to put you in jail. Whether
Yeah.
you black, whether you be Mexican, because you're going to do what it takes to feed your kid. And you can't go to court and go, well, Your Honor, they took away the benefits. Sorry, you broke the law. You stole.
Oh yeah.
But
Well,
now you're going
that's
to go to work again in the prison system. What's your take on
Yeah,
that?
that's the story. That's the story of Les Mis, right? That's
Yeah,
Victor Hugo going back to the French Revolution. That's the same thing now. You steal a loaf of bread and you're in prison, and then you're a part of the slave system again, which
yeah.
never went away. It's part of the legal framework of the clause that they passed to end slavery, was to keep it in the prison system. So you talk about, I mean, what's happening now with all the private prisons and all the American corporations that are benefiting from almost free prison labor, slave labor. It's completely unconscionable. And then you add in ICE too, and they're grabbing people off the street and then feeding them into this slave system, probably.
It is so funny. I just had this discussion with some people yesterday, and this is what they told me. You're crazy. The prison system doesn't work with corporations. And I go,
I saw an article, a headline just the other day. This is an older article, but it said that there are 500 American corporations benefiting from slave labor in Alabama alone. That's
yeah,
one state. So
yeah.
there's got if there's 500 working in one state, I bet
Imagine.
when you go across 50, it's a whole lot more than 500. And that's not even talking about the private prison system, where
Yeah,
there are private companies building prisons
yeah.
and operating them for profit. And see, the real downside of something like that is the profit motive, which is supposed to be so great. We hear all the time about how great the profit motive is, how great
Mhm,
capitalism is. But there's an expectation of growth. And if you have a company that makes profits off of having people imprisoned, you
mhm,
create, they have a need for profit to keep growing. So
mhm,
that they have a demand. Their demand to the government is keep sending us more people, keep sending us more people to imprison
mhm.
and to lock up and do free slave labor for these corporations.
Why do you think the average person doesn't understand this? And I tell people, you're not doomed by history. You're doomed by being ignorant to history, because history is just going to repeat itself, but it repeats it in a way that you don't see it happening. Because if I got somebody that tells me there's no way this is happening in the prison system, then you're blind, because you're doing the same thing that they did in the colonial years, that they did in slavery. If you stole a piece of bread, they put you outside and they put you in the guillotine, in that thing, and or they cut your hands
The
off, or they
stockade,
did
yeah,
something.
right.
Yeah, yeah. So now it's just done in a different way that won't bring um clarity to what's going on, who's pulling the strings. But why do you think people are having a difficult time just seeing the basic
Well,
concept of what the book was talking about?
yeah, Andre. I would point to one other book on my list, which is called Manufacturing Consent, and that's by a famous man named Noam Chomsky, who I love. I consider one of my intellectual fathers. Him and Michael Parenti, who did another book on this list.
Mm-hmm,
Um, But Noam Chomsky's book, Manufacturing Consent, talks about how consent is manufactured, just like a car is manufactured.
mm-hmm,
The the propaganda system, the American propaganda system, starts when we're watching Saturday morning cartoons on, when we're little kids, when we're watching things like Paw Patrol, which tells us that authority figures like police and firefighters are always trustworthy and that we should always, do what they say.
mm-hmm,
So an American propaganda system that works hard to get us to go along with this system
mm-hmm,
and to convince us. And this even extends into our churches. I've done some posts in the last few months talking about how, from a different book, which is not on this list, but talks about how in the 1940s, during or after the depression, well, during the depression, so during the 1930s,
mm-hmm,
American businesses were scared about how people were turning against capitalism. I mean, they were all going through the Great Depression, so they had good reason to be skeptical of capitalism, because in the 1920s they heard all the same free market stuff that we grew up hearing about how wonderful the free market is and how great free enterprise is, and people saw with their own eyes how it could have a very negative impact on them, and they weren't believing the propaganda anymore. So business people started paying pastors and priests and donating money to their churches to get them to spread a business pot, a pro business type of message to their parishioners.
mm-hmm,
So, you go into church and you're supposed to be hearing about God and how to be a good person, and they're slipping in messages about how great business is and how great the American free enterprise system is. So, you're not even in a skeptical mindset when you're young watching cartoons or in sitting in church or sitting in school, which also works a lot harder to make us into workers
mm-hmm.
in this capitalist system than it does to produce people who can actually think critically about any of it. We are conditioned from the very get-go to go along with it, to think this is the best possible option, and to be terrified of communism or workers owning any, workers owning business, which, like, why is that such a scary thing? The idea that the workers would own the place where they work. Like, that's not that's not a terrifying idea, I don't think. And in fact, there are hundreds of worker owned enterprises here in this country today that are operating just fine, uh, that prove that you don't have to send all of the money. I like to say that capitalism is a pyramid scheme. So, capitalism tends to send all that money up to the top, to those billionaires at the top of the pyramid. And we're the ones doing all the hard work. Those billionaires, their companies wouldn't be worth all that money if we weren't working hard every day to make it worth something.
And you know what's so funny? And some people might think this is a conspiracy theory, but when you talk about manufacturer consent, is we give away our the things that we're fighting about now. We carefully got blended into what you was talking about, the manufacturing consent, because even something as simple, and people don't get this, you've given away the most important thing you can probably imagine, which is your free will, and that's through a simple mobile device. You're
Mm.
talking about manufacturer consent. I remember, this is no lie, I remember in the 80s, I was talking to this guy, and he was like, "Hey, Andre, they've already given people the chip where they can track you." And they was doing it in, which we'll talk about Vietnam and so forth in a minute. They was giving it to these countries as experiment. And they said, he told me this. He said he was over there. He did video footage and everything. And that's when the first credit card called Blue came out, where they was putting your information on there. They said, but first we got to figure out how to get rid of money. And you know what I was saying? I said, you can't get rid of money. But I wasn't thinking, yeah, you can. So he said America would be the first, would be the last place they have to conquer, the people with the money. They said
Mm.
because they don't want to get rid of money, but we got to make them, like you said, manufacture consent. How do we do it? Well, you put fear in them. You put fear in them. You do war.
Very powerful.
You do war. You do, and they still didn't work. So then this is show you how crazy this shit is. And I know it's not lying. Then you start kidnapping babies. And then you say, okay, well, let's put a chip in the baby when they're born. You got to consent because people are kidnapping babies.
Mm.
Now let's put it in your animal. Now let's go deeper. Now we got to really track you. Now let's give you the ultimate weapon. Let's give you a cell phone and allow you, this is manufacturer consent. That's fix the apps where you don't have to have money no more. You put everything on your phone. Convenience.
Yep.
That's what I want to use. Manufacturer consent and manufacturing convenience.
Yep.
Now you
Yep.
don't even,
Make it the only option. I mean, almost think about almost nobody doesn't walk around with a cell phone in their pocket now everywhere they go.
thank
So
you.
talk about how easy it is to track you. They have, my phone, when I get in my car, it's like, oh, you going home? Here's your directions. Like,
Yeah.
it just knows where I'm going because it follows me all the time.
And it's crazy how you see it happening because, like you said, not only is it manufacturer consent, it's also manufacturer convenience, but it's also where it's manufactured without any options.
That's right.
Because
They want to lead you. They want to lead you down the path. So that's the only thing you could ever conceive of.
well,
And a
look,
lot of I see those commenters all the time in my posts when I question the capitalist system. They come at me and they're like, you're crazy. You don't know what you're talking about. This is the best possible system we could ever have. Look how rich we are as Americans compared to the rest of the world. But meanwhile, we're all just scraping by, like
yeah.
even people in the 90th percentile of income are spending most of the money they make every month. It's our lifestyle keeps up with however much money we make. So even people who make a lot of money are spending all that money every month. And how much of that money is going to the bank every month? Think about your credit card payment,
Mhm.
your car payment, your mortgage payment. Like all the, you talk about you get your paycheck and then hand 70-80% over to different banks before you even have any money to spend on anything else in your life.
But some people might think we're just talking shit. And I remember during the last election campaign, um, one of my questions to the Democratic Party and the Republican Party here, I was like, what are you going to do about housing?
Right.
People can't even afford to get a house. I mean, to rent an apartment. You know, people can't even afford to buy eggs. Eggs are $9 for 12. But you can't even raise the amount of money, the minimum wage, to offset it, and the rich keeps getting richer, and the poor keep working to feed
That's right.
to feed.
Yeah. This, you mentioned it earlier, the SNAP benefits being cut, and that's because in a capitalist system, the system we have, the people who are poor, or the people who are homeless,
Yeah.
or the people who are on SNAP benefits, what have you, they exist as a warning to everyone else that if you don't participate in this system, if you don't jump into the rat race and try and keep getting to the next spot in your career, or trying to get a higher paying job or whatever, that you're going to end up like these people, like a home, you end up homeless,
Mm-hmm.
and you end up living in your car. And then that exists as a warning that you had better jump into this system and participate, or you'll get left behind. And so that's why people, the rich in this system, they don't care about housing for the homeless. They don't care about SNAP benefits for people who can't afford to buy groceries.
Mm-hmm.
Those people exist as a warning to everybody else to shape up and to participate, or get crushed. And so that's why in a socialist system, that's not the whole plan. The plan is like, we lift everybody up so that there's a baseline, so that so that housing, you can have a house for everyone. We have what, 5 or 6 empty houses for every homeless person in this country.
Mm-hmm.
It's a false, there's a false scarcity, and there's false scarcity all over the place in our system. How much food? I think 1/3 of all the food in every grocery store ends up thrown in the garbage,
Yeah.
because it's false scarcity. We have more than enough food to go around for every hungry person. In fact, we could end hunger for just a few, it's not that many billions. We
You
could
know
end
what?
hunger for every person on this planet.
You know,
But
before
the
I
capitalist
told
system does not want that.
I'm glad you said that, because when I tell people that, they look at me like I'm crazy. I'm like, there's never a shortage of food. We have tons of alcohol. I live in the Midwest. You live in the Midwest.
Yeah.
There's tons of farmland that's not even being farmed. And the reason
Yep.
that they don't farm is because the government tells them not to. They pay them to not to do that.
Right.
But the farmers ain't gonna tell you that. They get a check.
Right. Yeah. Well, and it's not even farmers. It's like 4 companies that own like 80 or 90% of all the farmland. Oh,
Yeah.
interesting fact. Bill Gates, the Windows, billionaire, used to be the richest man on earth, has slipped down a few slots, but he's the biggest landowner in our country.
Yeah.
And that's just like George Washington was. This is a little known fact. George Washington owned more land than any other person in the country. So even back then, the founding fathers, we call them, they were the richest dudes in the country. Who else but the richest guys in the country could afford to take 4 months off
Yeah.
from like what, May to September in 1789 to write the Constitution?
Yeah.
That no working man could do that. No working person could do that. So the whole thing was set up from the very start to benefit the owning people, the people who owned things. John Jay, our first Supreme Court justice, said the people who own the country should run it. And that's what we got. And that's where we are right now still.
Let's talk about another book that was very impactful, which I thought was cool. The People of the United States and the
Oh,
mythology behind that. That's deep, because I tell people, if you go back deep enough and you understood the founding of this country, you also start to recognize how the class consciousness, the new word, came to be. You then see how stories like the Bacon Rebellion changed the narrative. You see how the founding forefathers used we'll talk about on part 2, their so-called heritage, to create a new word, which is called white.
yes. Yeah, that's a great example. So, People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn, one of the greatest books I ever read.
Mhm.
Huge eye opener for me. Deep, deep history, and very much not the kind of history that you hear in your history classes in high school, because
Yeah.
those classes are about manufacturing consent, about getting us to believe, oh, this is the greatest system that ever existed, and
Mhm.
oh, the founding fathers were such, they were so noble, and they had such lofty aspirations. True. I don't want to say that's not entirely true, but they also had personal interests. And
They had a
you
personal
talk
agenda when
about
they
the
came
people,
here.
the
Yeah.
slaveholders, there were a number of slaveholders who helped write the Constitution, helped come up with the three-fifths compromise, which horrible blot on our history that we don't spend a whole lot of time talking about. We skip right over that. That a slave is only worth three-fifths as much as anybody else living in those areas is awful.
Mhm.
But the whole concept of whiteness was, just as you say, and Zinn just talks about this in his book, was created because um, in the in the pre-revolutionary period, uh, when slaves were first coming to the colonies, the the people just saw them as human beings, just like
Yeah.
them, and they had to stop white people from from intermingling and feeling sympathy for the slave population,
Mhm.
because they could see this is just another human being right here. So they had to create a social hierarchy in
Mhm.
order to keep them separate, in order to make the white residents feel superior to the slave residents. And that was it was created out of, it didn't exist. It's
No.
we've had these ideas. We live, we've lived hundreds of years since these ideas were first implemented, so they
Mhm.
seem like the most normal thing in the whole world. But it was created out of nothing, and it was created out of self-interest of the owning class.
When you read that book, and naturally a lot of people need to understand Bacon's rebellion and to understand that this stuff was, let's go back again, manufactured. They didn't know it was
Yeah.
manufactured. They had an idea of what they was trying to put into place. But it's
Right.
amazing. Like I tell people, history never died. It just rebranded. Thank you. It just
Mm-hmm.
rebranded. And it rebranded so strong that it's been, like you said, not even taught in school.
No.
Not even taught in school, the real. Because I think if people, this is a two-part question. This is a hypothetical question for you. I think people are afraid to know the truth.
Mm.
And let me break it down a little bit. So I don't want people to say, I'm not afraid of nothing. What I mean by that is you may not want to go down the rabbit hole because you're not sure how you're going to react to the information. You don't know if you're
Yeah.
going to react in fear and panic. You really don't know how to receive it, and you don't know how to respond to it. Is what I'm saying. What's your take on that?
Yeah. I think you're totally right. There's something called cognitive dissonance, where your brain tries to hold two contradictory ideas at the same time.
Mhm.
And when you can see something with your eyes that doesn't match up with what you feel or what you've been taught your whole life, it creates a sense of discomfort. And it's very natural to just lean into the part that you learned your whole life and just say, no, 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 I know the thing I've seen with my eyes. I can look away, because I know that the things I learned, the things that I feel comfortable with, because I've been hearing them my whole life, that's real. So
Mhm.
I'm just going to hold on to that even harder,
Mhm.
because it's hard to let those things go. It's hard to admit that you've been manipulated. It's hard to admit that you've been manipulated by people who even have kind intentions, like your school teachers, your elementary teachers, your high school teachers.
Mhm.
It's not that they're bad people, but they are perpetuating uh, a system that promotes hierarchy, that promotes racial hierarchy, that
Mhm.
promotes economic hierarchies, promotes men over women. And these things are baked deep, deep into our system. And as we were just saying, a lot of those choices were conscious choices that were made to benefit the people at the top, that who are largely the white owning class, who are men, who are straight, who are Christian, who are, like a lot of the things in these hierarchies, you know, we're conditioned to believe that that is the way things should be, and because that's the way things are now, we're like, oh well, I guess that's just the way things are, and that's just the way they'll always be, or that's the way they have always been. But you come to find out when you look into history that that's not how things have always been. That social hierarchies as they exist now have not always existed in this way, and that it is possible for people to um, see equality as the way out of these hierarchies. If we all relate to one another as human beings and see one another as human beings, that's how we can get out of this. It's because it's through unity. Because there's so many more working people, and if we just look at each other as fellow human beings who are also workers, who are all in the same boat, we way outnumber this small social class of people who own everything right now. And we don't have to keep things the way they are. But I understand, like you say, that it's scary to confront that and try to think about changing any of that.
What's your take? Before we go to the next book, what's your take on the Charlie Kirk assassination, the storming of the White House with
Yeah.
the president? What do you think all that was boiled down, based on your opinion and your research on what we're dealing with now? What's your take on all that? Was it a conspiracy theory? Was he basically saying things that people didn't, that the hierarchy didn't want him to say? Do you think that he was assassinated because they wanted to make him a martyr? Why do you think
Hmm.
that people stormed into the White House? Nobody has stormed into the White House, not even during slavery.
Right. Right.
That's crazy.
Yeah. I mean, Charlie Kirk, that's a loaded one. There's a lot going on there, but I believe that he was essentially an articulate propagandist for hierarchy.
Okay.
He was saying that the existing hierarchy is valid and that we should keep it. Like his ultimate message is that men should be over women, and that white folks should be over black folks and brown folks, and that rich people should be over poor people. And I reject those ideas. I don't agree with any of that.
Mhm.
I think that's all wrong. I think the way things are now is completely unfair and should definitely be changed towards greater equality, especially greater economic equality, which will help balance all the other unequal hierarchies as
Mhm.
well. Um, but I you know I tend to believe. I mean, I don't know anything, but the people who say that because Charlie Kirk was turning against Israel, that was the reason that he was killed, that that has plausibility to me, because as a person who makes social media content, I've seen the power of the pro-Israel strain on social media,
Mhm.
and I know how powerful that is. It's a very powerful propaganda arm. They have what's called Hezbollah. It's run by the IDF. It's people in soldiers in Israel who work on social media, who help promote the propaganda messages that give people sympathy towards Israel and what they're doing. So when people talk about them, but it's there's no proof. There's no solid proof at this
Mhm.
point, but it's a real taboo. But that's um, I've never I haven't talked about it in any of my posts, but that's kind of where I lean. As far as January 6th goes,
Yeah.
I think I think there's a lot of resentment in our society. And I think people on the right feel resentment just like people on the left. And I think Trump has successfully convinced a lot of people on the right that he's fighting for them.
Mhm.
In my opinion, Trump lies about just about everything he says. He's not an honest person, and I don't think anybody. So I'm just surprised that anybody believes anything he says.
Why do you
But
think he got
you,
elected too? Why do you think this has always puzzled me, and nobody to this day has really come forward with what may seem to be a legitimate educational reply. If if you know this guy is transparent, he's always been transparent. we know how he is. We knows what he's done. Why did he wind up getting reelected? Do you think it was because the uh, the opposite side, the Democratic Party, wasn't strong enough to address issues? Because he really didn't give any concrete reasons why he should really be elected. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So was the Democrat, which we talk on part two, was the right hand better than the left?
I don't think better. But I think I wrote an article about this before Trump was elected, and I think that there's a huge segment of our population, our voting public, who feel like neither party represents them, and they feel completely abandoned, and they are justified in feeling that way. And I think some people saw with Trump a person who was going to tear down the existing system. They didn't know how it was going to happen.
But then it was
They
going to happen.
didn't know they didn't know specifically what it was going to look like, but they saw in Trump a wrecking ball, and they said, "Let it go, let it wreck this thing, and let's see what happens on the other side." Now, unfortunately, with ICE and all the fascistic things that moves that the Trump administration is making, it's looking like he's going to take us into straight on dictatorship to end the constitutional republic that we had before. But so there's but when you talk about the Democrats, yeah, they weren't offering anything.
Yeah.
I think one of the most important issues in that election, to many on the left, was the genocide in Gaza, and the Democrats were not willing to change, to be different from the Republicans on that,
Mhm.
because both parties are completely committed to supporting Israel no matter what. So, um, there just wasn't enough differentiation, like you say. And I think it really boils down to capitalism, because both parties, there's a right wing commentator named Kevin Phillips. He's written several books I really like. He used to be a speechwriter for Nixon back in the day, and he said that the Democratic Party is the second most committed capitalist party in the world, only
Mm.
behind the Republican Party. So both parties really, they're completely dependent on the money that rich people give them. We call them campaign donations
Mhm.
in our society, but it's basically legalized bribery, where corporations and rich people can put as much money as they want into any candidate, and both parties are completely implicated by that legalized bribery system.
That is crazy. Let's talk about this other book, which I love, "The Lies My Teacher Told Me" by James.
Great one.
Yeah, that's crazy. What was so impactful with that book that made you read it? And how after going through the couple of books that you already went through, how did this take it to another level?
Yeah. Well, I think for a lot of people, we talk about Howard Zinn's book, People's History of the United States, but it's a really big, long, thick book. It took me forever to get through.
Mhm.
And if I had it to do over again, I probably would have started with James Lowen's Lies My Teacher Told Me, because it's a much more accessible book. It covers a lot of the same material, a lot of the same history. They're both history books, but I found it to be much more accessible as a reader, easier to get through, faster to get through.
Mhm.
And he makes a lot of great points. Like he wrote a different book that's not on this list, uh, about about how the slave issue was what caused the Civil War. And he's like, well, how do you tell? Because since then, they say, oh, it was all about it was about trade, or it was about this, or it was about that. It wasn't about slavery. And so he's like, well, let's go to all the articles of succession for each state, and right there in the Mississippi Articles of Secession that they wrote up, slavery's number one on the list, right?
Mhm.
It's in protecting the slave system, and then going down the list. And all these other states, it was about slavery. It was clearly about protecting the slave system, which is an economic system,
Mhm.
because that was how the southern economies were run.
Mhm.
So Lowen likes to do that. He'll go to the direct sources and show you how the stories that you heard, the narratives that you've heard,
Mhm.
um, have been cooked up, and there's a lot of picking and choosing that happens over time to create narratives that reinforce the power structure, that help manufacture consent. And so he's going back to the history and saying, well, the history is actually different from what you learned.
Well, was that a two-part um, analogy on this? Because I was also, from my studies, also told that not only was it about slavery, but it was more so also, in addition to that, about one currency. Because remember, we had the
Mm.
Confederacy currency, and we had what is called U.S. currency, and controlling the
That
silver and
that's
the gold, the silver and the gold.
sure.
Because remember, I think a lot of people don't realize this. Back in the day, you was paid with silver dollars and gold dollars, you know,
Hmm.
and all the
And
same, everything
yeah,
was
back
paper
back in the
currency.
day, they had you could exchange paper money for gold.
Yeah,
That I mean, that was another aspect of it, but currency was not the main driver of that war, as Lowen shows that it was slavery was the motivation. It was the primary motivation for all the states that seceded.
yeah. To keep now, let's go back a little bit so people can understand how important this was, because agriculture has always been the stable of economies, even 10,000 years ago. It
Sure.
changed the way it actually was the new enterprise. Let's call it what it is. Before there was
Yeah.
gold and silver, if you had land and agriculture and could run it, you was pretty much a self-made millionaire, so to speak.
Yeah, well, you talk about the rise of agriculture. That really is also the birth of hierarchies, because before, when we had primarily hunter and gatherer societies, people didn't stay in one place; they
Right.
moved around. And from this part of the year, you'd hunt deer over in this area, and this part of the year, you'd fish for salmon over in this area.
Mhm.
And there was an awareness that you wouldn't try to deplete the resources, because if you hunted too many deer, you might come back and there'd be none left because they were wiped out by last year's hunting.
Mhm.
So that tended to make people a little more aware of the limitations of resources, since they were living off the land. But then when we moved to agriculture, people were living in one place. You're living right with that plot of land all year long, and that plot of land would also give surplus. It would give you than more than you could eat in one year
Mhm.
or eat at one time. And so when you start building up surpluses, that's the beginnings of fortunes, because the surplus doesn't all just go to everybody. It goes to one person. One person is hoarding it. And if I own this land, it belongs to me.
Mhm.
So then that was the basis of fortunes starting to build up, and one person paying some person than less than they needed to in order to maximize their returns. Anyway, I've done some posts about that also. There's a great writer named David Graeber, who did a book called The History of Everything, that talks about the rise of how hierarchy basically started with agriculture.
When you was reading the book, The Lies My Teachers Told Me, what was at least the one of the most impactful parts of that book that literally rocked you to your core? Because we
I,
know history is not what they teach us.
Yeah. One of my favorite ones, and I just did a post about this recently. Um, there was a contest on TikTok to do a history post, and so I did one about a story I read in there about Squanto and about the Thanksgiving story. We always hear this story about Thanksgiving, that the natives sat down, that the natives helped the English colonists. One native named Squanto helped the English colonists learn how to plant corn,
Mhm.
and he would put chopped up fish bits in with the corn to help fertilize the soil and give the plant nutrients to help grow faster. But we don't know about Squanto. We don't learn about. It's actually a much more interesting story than we get with the traditional Thanksgiving type of pageant that kids put on when they're in second grade or third grade,
Mhm.
and make paper cardboard or feathers out of construction paper. Squanto actually lived in the village that the colonists went to in Plymouth Rock. Um, there was a town near there named Patuxet that all the villagers had been wiped out by plague just about 2 or 3 or 4 years before the colonists got there.
Mm.
And Squanto had actually been kidnapped into slavery twice before they got there to Plymouth Rock. So he knew English from actually, it said he may have made 3 transatlantic trips on ships before the colonists arrived in Plymouth Rock. So there's so much backstory to this tale that we don't even get in our history classes. That's so much more interesting about how plague wiped out about 90%, they say, of Native American populations between the time of Columbus and when the colonists arrived in Plymouth Rock. So for a couple hundred years, people were dropping like crazy. And
Mm.
Patuxet, everybody in Patuxet was dead except for Squanto because he wasn't there. He was gone. And so when he came back, the colonists were there, and he's like, "Well, this is my town. They're living in my town. I may as well help them."
Mm.
But fascinating story.
Let's go to Michelle Alexander. I thought this was really
Oh,
cool.
so good.
The new Jim Crow. And I tell
Love that
people
book.
Jim Crow never stopped.
That's
It
right.
rebranded itself.
Yeah,
When you read
that's
it,
right.
I think it's fun. I don't mean any disrespect here. I think it's beautiful, and it's even more beautiful that a man that's not of a different nationality, meaning black, has taken interest in this. So when you
Yeah.
read this, the new Jim Crow, from a white standpoint, and you read it, what was this like for you to read and internalize this?
Yeah, heartbreaking. And so I think, you look at, we since the civil rights movement, we supposedly made so much progress, right? And
Mhm.
it's no longer legal to discriminate against a person because of the color of their skin in our legal system, right? That was one of the achievements of the civil rights movement.
Mhm.
But this is how Jim Crow just extended and rebranded, like you said. It's totally legal to discriminate against a person if they've been convicted of a crime.
Yeah.
So you can take a person and you can deny them SNAP benefits. You can deny them an application to live in an apartment. You can deny them a job. You can. It's completely legal to discriminate against people if they have a felony conviction. So it creates a whole class of people who are completely outside of our system.
Mhm.
Like what, and you hear about that's how you end up with people who've been convicted just becoming homeless. They have no place to go.
Or they go
We've
back
completely
into the
cut them off.
system. They go
And
back as a recidivism
right,
because you've already started a new class consciousness and didn't even realize it.
yeah, yeah, it's horrific. And you add on top of that the legal slave system where you have convicts who are working in prison for companies like AT&T or whoever, doing telemarketing calls or customer service calls, and they're not even getting paid minimum wage. They're getting paid 25 cents an hour
I
or
was going to
something,
say
something
25 cents.
ridiculous. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, it's so horrible. And so, you know, it just it breaks my heart that we think the main story with the civil rights movement is that we've moved beyond all that. But then you read Michelle Alexander's book and find out that no, it's just called a different thing now. And that's another reason to keep, um, you know, going after poor communities, because they're the ones who can fight back the least.
Mm, mm, mm. That's where we wrap up. Let's get to the next book. The rich get richer and the poor get prison. Man, that's deep.
Yeah. It always, people always laugh when they hear that title, but it's true. It's a sick joke that our society is playing because the rich, you talk about businesses cutting corners, or somebody gets caught embezzling $1 million or $100 million or something like that, and they get a little slap on the wrist.
Mhm.
The judge is like, oh, they're a good person, upstanding member of the society, so you could get 6 months in country club prison. But if you steal $100 from Target, or $100 of merchandise, you're going away for years.
Yeah.
You're branded a criminal, and you're gonna, they'll throw the book at you.
Yeah.
And unless you can afford, well, Howard Zinn in his book The People's History, I think one of the things he said was that the true difference between the rich and everybody else is a rich person has a lawyer.
Yeah.
They have an attorney. They already have somebody that they have a relationship with who's going to defend their interests. And for a rich person to put down $3,000 or $5,000 for some kind, like, to a lawyer, a deposit or whatever, a retainer
Retainer.
they call it, um, that's nothing for them. But
Yes.
for somebody like me or you, I mean that's a chunk of change, and I don't. That's not easy for a person to do with a lawyer, to get a lawyer, and a person who can't afford even the retainer. Well, you're just out of luck. You got to deal with a public defender and hope they can do something for you.
You know
But
what?
the entire system is built
Yeah.
to just feed more people into convictions. Like more than 90%, 97%, I think, of convictions are from plea bargains,
You know,
because part of the way that prosecutors and everybody in the justice system, they're all incentivized to keep those numbers up, keep those metrics up. I got this many convictions this year, and only so many people went to trial, or only so many people actually got acquitted.
it's so
And our system is just designed to just funnel as many people as possible once they're arrested, even if they're guilty or not, into prison.
and it's so funny that you said that, and I tell people when I was dealing with my custody, I had the number one lawyer, Judy Hester, and you're right. I seen how the system works. If I walked in there with any mojo, I would have been like blah blah blah. But this is what I tell people: spend your money on your legal team. Because at the end of the day, that's you're gonna have to eventually wind up in that courtroom to some degree. Trust me, you're gonna wind up in there and you won't even know it. And you better have somebody, because if not, just like you said, they're gonna treat you just like Joe Blow.
Yep.
And if you get treated like Joe Blow, it's not good. The last book,
Yep.
and I thought this was really neat. Let's talk about the shock.
Yes, shock doctrine.
Yeah,
Yeah, Naomi Klein, great book. That was a real eye opener for me. Talking about how it was the first book that I read that really talked about a man named Milton Friedman. Now he was a economics professor based out of University of Chicago,
that's the
and
Freeman theory,
he
right? That's the Freeman theory, right?
Sure. Yeah. We call his theories neoliberal economics,
Okay.
which and those are defined by privatization, cutting taxes on the rich and corporations, deregulation. So those are some of the biggest markers, and it's just such a funny coincidence to me that Friedman's theories benefited the rich and corporations so much, and are bad for the majority of the public. But Friedman was writing at a time he was writing in the 40s and 50s when he was first coming up with his ideas, and he was kind of a reaction to another economist called uh, uh, Maynard Keynes, Lord Keynes from England, who believed in using the power of the government to help people in economic crises.
Hmm.
And this was kind of the birth of some uh, social democratic policies. That's how we got Social Security. That's how we got SNAP. That's how we got Medicaid and Medicare. Where the idea that the government could use its resources to help the public, and that's called socialism. But Friedman hated socialism. He was terrified of it, and he, like others on the right, like someone like Ayn Rand, knew that he could have a real successful career advocating for the rich, advocating on their behalf, and making it sound like what they called it during the Reagan and Thatcher era, when they were really grabbing onto his ideas hard. They called it they said there is no alternative. Like, this is the only thing we can do to save our economy when things get bad, when we have something like stagflation, a period in the 70s when wages were stagnating and inflation was going up at the same time. Something we may be getting very soon again here in this country. But so I reading Shock Doctrine is where I learned about Milton Friedman and how his ideas are. Um, One of his things that he loved to talk about is, there every you want to use every kind of catastrophe. You want to be ready with your stuff for the next bad thing that comes along. So you can whip it out and say, here's what we should do, and advocate your ideas. And shock doctrine, she talks about shock therapy and uses it as a metaphor. It's the same idea, where you shock a patient and then you come in and try and put something on top while they're still in shock
Hmm.
to retrain their brain. They do the same thing with the economy in a situation like Hurricane Katrina, where New Orleans was wiped out. They come in and they're like, we should privatize the school system. It's like, what's that got to do with anything?
Hmm.
No, but it's privatizing the school system makes it easier for the wealthy to indoctrinate students and put in the kind of education system that creates workers rather than thinkers. And they did all that when Katrina, the whole community was just reeling. People weren't even all back yet, and they were making huge changes to the school system and deregulating and privatizing things. It's just those privatization, like what they did here in Chicago with the parking spaces. They sold all parking meters to a company in Dubai. And again, it's the profit motive. So that company in Dubai is expecting to constantly have growth in its profits over time. Now, where are they getting those profits? From every person who parks in Chicago.
Mm.
They privatize, so every time you feed the meter, it's not going to Chicago like it used to. It's tax base. It's going to a company in Dubai. It's leaving the country. Money
That,
leaving the country for the enrichment of some very wealthy people.
that would
So
that
those
would
are some
explain
very damaging economic ideas. I'm sorry, Andre, what'd you say?
why you guys' roads are never fixed.
Yeah, that too. You're right, exactly,
Yeah.
because that money doesn't go into Chicago to help manage Chicago. It just leaves Chicago.
So before we wrap up, Scott, and we're gonna have you come back for part two because your story goes a lot deeper. We're gonna talk about the impact of a war, mainly Vietnam, and um, its effect on what we see today, and a little bit more about history of this of um, the economy in general, but a lot of other topics. How are you being received right now on social media with your way of thinking?
I've been very happy. I've been doing it almost 3 years now. I started my TikTok channel, my Substack, about 3 years ago,
Mhm.
and I've had steady growth. I'm up to about 85,000 followers on TikTok, which is that feels really good. That feels like a lot of indication. And when I make my posts, I would say that generally it's more positive than negative.
Yeah.
I think people can sense that something's not right
Hmm.
in our society, and they don't understand, what's the disconnect. Why are things so hard? Why do groceries keep getting more expensive? And why hasn't my paycheck, why don't they ever give me more than a 3% raise at work? Why am I stuck in the same place?
Hmm.
And it's because of the class system. It's because of capitalism, because so much of all our hard work is fed up to very few people who benefit from the way that our society is set up. And when somebody like me comes along and says that it doesn't have to be that way,
Hmm.
and further, if you look back in history, it hasn't always been that way.
Hmm.
I think that's a message that people are ready to hear, because so many people, right and left, feel frustration with the way our economy is set up, the way our society is set up. Um, Horrible institutions like patriarchy and white privilege and class privilege are the reason why we're in this place.
Mm.
And so the power that we have hope. There is hope for the future. And look at monarchies have fallen, dictators have fallen, slave systems have fallen. It's possible, even when you're in it, to think, you think, oh, this could never change, but it can change. Things can change. Things can get better. And so people, when they read my Substacks or watch my social media posts, are happy to get that message, because we're not powerless. And in fact, there's so much more of us than there are of the people who run and benefit from our society, that it is possible to change it.
Scott, thank you so much for taking time out to come on the show and help us understand what class conscious actually is and how people can do their part in um, elevating themselves because that's what it's about. You have to take accountability for yourself. How can the viewers reach out to you, Scott, to know where you're at on social media?
Look me up and Let's Make Them Pay on TikTok and let's make them pay.substack.com. That's my personal Substack. That's my main bread and butter that I love. But I'm also on Instagram. Let's Make Them Pay book. Also, Let's Make Them Pay on YouTube, Blue Sky. So you can find me on any of those, and I hope that you will.
Ladies and gentlemen, make sure you click, subscribe, and follow. Sometime all you need to do is click somebody's button and change the difference in somebody else's life as well as your own. We're going to have Scott come back and go deeper into the class conscious and help you to elevate your mind at the same time. Ladies and gentlemen, this has been another exciting episode of the Andre the Beast Crayton Show.